I'm a lecturer in ancient history at the University of Glasgow. I did my PhD on the Greco-Roman period in Egypt, so hence my sort of general interest in this. I'm the co-director, co-founder of the University of Glasgow Games and Gaming Lab, and as a result, I'm particularly interested in the use of history and archaeology in video games. And at the University of Glasgow, I offer an undergraduate and postgraduate course called Cleopatra Life and Legend. And that teaches students both about the historical Cleopatra and the reception of her from late antiquity to the present day. And in this paper, I am going to explore the video game Assassin's Creed Origins from the perspective of an ancient historian with a special interest in Greco-Roman Egypt and Cleopatra, and examine the way that Cleopatra is portrayed in it. So, cast your minds back 10 years to Assassin's Creed 2. Was anybody playing Assassin's Creed 2 then? Yeah. Me too. It was actually, I think, the first Assassin's Creed game I really played. I didn't bother with the first one. But yes, so, playing as Ezio Auditore da Firenze, you discover a secret chamber in the Basilica San Marco in Venice, and what appears to be the tomb of the ancient assassin Amunet. You can see here. You will find out later it's not a tomb, it's actually a cenotaph, but you know, retconning. Just back there, really, you're looking at. And Amunet is, in-game, the assassin responsible for the death of Cleopatra. So you can come near the statue and get a little bit of information there about her. Presumably Ubisoft chose Cleopatra along with the other occupants of the secret chambers located in the game world, the assassins of Alexander the Great, Xerxes I, Caligula, Qin Shi Huang and Genghis Khan, because of their high profiles and their international name recognition. But this is a significant departure from the historical record. Although there's no consensus in the ancient sources regarding exactly how Cleopatra died, variously we're told it was one snake, it was two snakes, it was a poisoned hairpin, it was poisoned ointment. Sometimes no one knows, you know. But there is a consensus about the fact that she died by her own hand rather than anyone else's. Although in 2013, an American criminal profiler called Pat Brown suggested, based on no evidence whatsoever and no expertise in ancient history, but rather her own contemporary professional experience, that Cleopatra was murdered, and she thought that she was murdered on the orders of Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus. This idea got a lot of press internationally, a book and a documentary, so it was reasonably high profile. So this idea of a sort of alternative explanation for Cleopatra's death does have precedent, relatively recent precedent. I don't know if it was in any way sort of inspirational to any of the sort of stuff that sort of subsequently transpired. But 8 years before the release of Origins, so 2009, gamers were primed for the possibility of seeing an innovative and creative treatment of Cleopatra in a future game. With that in mind, how is Cleopatra presented in Origins? Is her portrayal an innovative and creative one, as the brief references in Assassin's Creed 2 and its successors suggested it would be? As I said earlier, I am coming at this from the perspective of an ancient historian with a special interest in Greco-Roman Egypt and Cleopatra, and also an enthusiastic, if not particularly expert, gamer. I was absolutely thrilled when Origins was announced, slightly less thrilled when I saw the trailer, and I'll explain why sort of over the course of this talk. In what follows, I'm not going to fact-check Origins. That would be simultaneously tedious and frustrating, and I would end up sounding as though I like the game a whole lot less than I actually do, because I actually do love it, and I'm looking forward to my schedule clearing so that I can play it again. But I am going to consider the choices made by Ubisoft, and where there have been significant divergences from the historical and archaeological records, and consider why these divergences have been made with reference to other presentations of Cleopatra in popular culture. This is all very much a work in progress, so I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts afterwards. I'm happy to take sort of questions and discuss any aspect of this or anything else that you think is relevant. So, some context then. The game opens in 49 BCE and covers a period of around 5 years, culminating in the assassination of Gaius Julius Caesar in 44 BCE. So Cleopatra goes from being around 20 years old to around 25 years old. It's an interesting choice of a period of time to focus on. Although it's a very eventful period in Cleopatra's life, encompassing the civil war between her and her brother Ptolemy XIII, and their younger siblings, brother Ptolemy XIV and sister Arsinoe, although they don't feature in the game. Cleopatra's alliance with Caesar, the birth of their son Caesarion, we know virtually nothing about it. In fact, although Caesar wrote an account of the civil wars that he participated in, he only mentioned Cleopatra 3 times, and that was only sort of just contextual detail, that the Queen of Egypt is feuding with her brother, that sort of thing, nothing at all personal. And the Alexandrian War, which was written about Caesar's war in Alexandria, his participation in the civil war between Cleopatra and her brother, this was written contemporaneously by an anonymous author. It tends to get sort of bunched in with Caesar's writings because it's sort of seems to be somebody who was there with Caesar, and it's written in the style of his Gallic Wars and his civil war. But that only mentions her once, and again in just a sort of purely just contextual descriptive way. So this whole period is open to dramatisation, adaptation, reimagining, whatever you prefer to call it. This absence of evidence is actually promising, you know, from our perspective, because it offers considerable scope for experimentation in the narrative and the character. But unfortunately, these aspects of the game don't always live up to their potential. So, Cleopatra mainly appears in Origins in expository cutscenes, and you know, for some gamers, they may just ignore those completely because they may not like cutscenes at all, may find them boring. That may be the moment you go and make yourself a cup of tea or whatever. But there are a few occasions where, playing as Bayek or Aya, you follow her to a specific destination and interact with her or watch her interact with other NPCs such as Caesar. These take place at a variety of locations within the game world. Apollodorus' villa, where she's living during her exile at the outset, Memphis, Heraklion, on board a ship, the royal palace at Alexandria, Alexander the Great's tomb in Alexandria, the Serapeum in Alexandria, and finally Caesar's villa in Rome. And this is how she is when you pretty much, well, for most of the game, this is how she is, and this is the way she is when you sort of see her in avatars and things like that. With the game, you can also choose to undertake a discovery tour. So yeah, she's one of the characters that you can play. Yeah, fairly near the top of the list. That's good. And you can wander the game world as Cleopatra. So these are just some images I found of people doing that with her as their avatar, and so you can put Cleopatra into the world of Hellenistic Egypt in the game as the game doesn't actually do itself. And there is a tour specifically dedicated to her. Now, I'll come on to that in a little while. First things first, her appearance. What did the historical Cleopatra look like? How does that compare with how she looks in the game? Well, no physical descriptions survive. Earlier sources such as Plutarch, and when I say earlier, he was writing about 150 years after Cleopatra had died, but he was using information from a family friend who had actually been based at Cleopatra's court in Alexandria. So we get quite a lot of interesting personal, fly-on-the-wall sort of information from him. He comments on her intelligence and her charisma and her people skills, and he actually states at one point that her beauty wasn't in her physical appearance, but her personality and the sound of her voice. So he's not saying that she's ugly, but he's basically saying that it wasn't about how she looked that made her so appealing. Later sources, such as Cassius Dio, he's writing about 250 years afterwards, simply refer to her as beautiful with no further elaboration because, of course, And this is something that TV and film adaptations have tended to go with, because it's easier to demonstrate that a female character is attractive and desirable by casting a beautiful actress to play her than it is attempting to write a compelling character. Her surviving portraits come in several different styles. These very much depend on how she was presenting herself and to whom she was presenting herself. So, at home in Egypt, her Egyptian portraiture is very traditionally Egyptian. So we've got some examples up here. And you know, for our purposes, although the Egyptian style of portraiture is very interesting, artistically and historically, it's limited in what it can tell us about how someone actually did look. It's far from realistic, although it can perhaps tell us about the way that she dressed. You know, the traditional accoutrements of Egyptian royalty, such as crowns and headdresses, you know, clothing, jewelry. Ancient Roman writers do describe her as dressing as the goddess Isis on special occasions, so there is that as well. I mean, what the Roman writers viewed as costume, perhaps this was her regular style of dress, but we don't really know. Out with Egypt, in other territories controlled by Egypt or those controlled by the Roman Empire under the supervision of Antony, we see a very different Cleopatra. The only securely identified portraits of her are found on coins, so you know, the portraits, and these are potentially more realistic. They are done in a naturalistic style, but at the same time, I mean, you can see these two coins are quite different, really. I mean, this one's obviously a sort of finer portrait; it's more detailed, but you know, they aren't necessarily, you wouldn't necessarily think they're the same woman. You know, the nose is different, the chin is different. She has a standard hairstyle. It's famously called the melon hairstyle because it involves sort of sweeping the hair back into a big bun at the nape of the neck. She has, you know, the diadem of Ptolemaic royalty to sort of indicate that she's a queen. She's got, you know, lots of lovely jewellery. She was very famous for wearing pearls, for example. But this is fairly standard for any elite woman of this period. It is obviously quite different from the Egyptian guys. There are also some insecurely identified portraits. These are referred to, these are identified tentatively as Cleopatra based on the similarities with her coinage. So this is one that you'll quite often see in textbooks and things like that. And it's a marble portrait head. It could be anybody, but because it's got the melon hairstyle, it's called Cleopatra. And this one as well, this is a fresco that could be the goddess Venus Genetrix and Cupid, her son, or it could be Cleopatra and Caesarion in the guise of the goddess Venus Genetrix and Cupid. So it's sort of they may well be Cleopatra, but we don't know for sure, and it's sort of wishful thinking on the part of archaeologists and historians. And in any case, these aren't exactly all identical anyway. In game, she is much closer to the Egyptian style than the Greco-Roman style. You just sort of click back. Here. And sort of, yeah, actually that gives us a nice sort of full-length view. But even then, I mean, if you sort of have a look at these and then sort of these, it's not the same. And this is the case even when she's in Rome at the end of the game. She's still dressed in this sort of Egyptianizing way. Notably, considering recent debates over her ethnicity, it's frequently argued now that she was at least in part of African descent, and this is not something that is apparent when you know, actresses are cast to play her. So she's in Origins. If I go back again I think we can safely say that she's ethnically indeterminate, really. Considering the fact that Origins presents Hellenistic Egypt as otherwise extremely ethnically diverse throughout, I think this is something of a missed opportunity, and I do wonder here, are Ubisoft attempting to have their cake and eat it? You know, you can see what you want to see in her, essentially. Or are they simply sitting on the fence in an attempt to avoid controversy? And I'll come back to that later as well. So where are we next? Right. So, regarding her dress, I think I've counted over the course of the game, she's got 4 different outfits that we tend to see her in, and I've managed to find 3 of them there. I couldn't get an image of the end of the game where she's in Rome, but it's fairly similar to that, cloak and everything. Now, in the game, she is undoubtedly dressed in an orientalizing way, and this follows on from 19th century portrayals and racist and sexist ideas about the exotic East and its people and its customs. And these orientalizing ideas undoubtedly influenced previous portrayals in a range of media, and these portrayals have in turn influenced later ones. So, for example, you know, Cleopatra is a very popular topic in 19th century painting, following on from the sort of the rediscovery of Egypt, the reopening of it to the West. And we tend to see images like this. She's usually very sort of scantily clad, she's usually reclining in a very sort of loose way. She's usually got some kind of like animal skin, because you know, the East and barbarians, etc. And then jewellery as well, because it's sort of luxury and extravagance. And so these sort of motifs appear again and again. So this is a very famous painting which you may have seen before, and it sort of commemorates Antony and Cleopatra's famous meeting. And so here we have Cleopatra in the, you know, the pose and the clothing and everything else that I was just saying. Antony's sort of coming on board her ship. She's surrounded with this sort of luxury and decadence. She's even got visibly African slaves, they would have been, I suppose, rather than servants, around her. And the same sort of thing, around about the same sort of time, from John William Waterhouse. You can see the animals and the jewellery and the gold and everything else. And then we get sort of little episodes from her life. So in this one, this idea that she's preparing for her death by testing poisons on prisoners. And again, you know, all of this kind of, these sort of let the viewer know, the viewer is very comfortable with these as sort of signifiers of Egypt and the East and this period of history. And this finds its way from art into things like advertising. So here are some Palmolive soap adverts, and from around about 1900 all the way through to the 60s, Palmolive used Cleopatra in its advertising. In the early 20th century, the adverts were sort of full-on colour pages like this, with sort of Cleopatra, very much all these signifiers of Egypt, you know, pylons and pyramids in the background, and you know, the costume and the slaves. And these gradually, as we get through the 20th century and into the sort of 50s, 60s, they get smaller and smaller, get in the corner of the advert, but essentially the text remains the same. You know, if you use Palmolive soap, which is made from like natural palm oil from Egypt, you will be as beautiful and seductive as Cleopatra. And we see this find its way into theatre, TV, films, music videos, adverts, even photo shoots these days. A few years ago, Kim Kardashian actually did a photo shoot in which she sort of dressed as Cleopatra, modelled herself after Cleopatra, and talked about how much she loved both Cleopatra and the Elizabeth Taylor film version of Cleopatra. Interestingly, Cleopatra in Origins outfits, I think, are particularly close to those of Cleopatra in HBO's Rome. And there are other, I mean, this one particularly, I think, is quite similar to this one. And I'll show you, I've got some more pictures of Rome throughout the presentation, so we'll see some different ones. But yes, and so not just the clothing, but other aspects of her presentation, such as her use of opium and her casual cruelty to underlings. And if we look closely, her jewellery and her clothing, they sort of seem to be something of a hybrid. So here's another one. This is Cleopatra. She's just been playing hunting with the slaves, and she's actually been shooting them with her bow and arrow. And there's something similar in the game, which I'll get onto in a while. Yes. So there is some sort of hint of sort of authentic Egyptian in her presentation in Origins. And so we can see here the very famous bust of Nefertiti from much earlier in history, but this clearly has been sort of influential with the headdress and the colours and the jewellery style as well, and perhaps even, I suppose, the facial features too. But we also see some Syrian influences, and so with the portraits that come from Palmyra, the women are fabulously decked out in jewellery in a way that in the sort of Greco-Roman standard portraits they really aren't. I mean, portraits of women from classical Greece, Hellenistic Greece, portraits of women from the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, they don't tend to wear any jewellery because it's seen as extravagant and luxurious and the sign of sort of like a weak character that all you want to do is shop and care about pretty things. Whereas in the sort of eastern part of the Roman Empire, sort of Syria and so on, clearly this is not the case, because if it were, we would not have these fantastic portraits with women absolutely decked in jewellery of all kinds. And so particularly things like the jewellery coming down over the face and the sort of chains and things like that, I think these we can see something of that in Origins of Cleopatra. And this isn't completely inappropriate, because members of the Seleucid royal family who ruled Syria in the Hellenistic period did actually marry into the Ptolemaic dynasty. And we can also see the same kinds of 19th century penchant for orientalising in portraits of Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, who she is sort of a much later ancient queen in the 3rd century CE, but she claimed to be descended from Cleopatra. So we sort of see this same kind of thing. This is all very very similar. So that's her appearance. What about her behaviour? Well, throughout the game, she refers to herself as Pharaoh. I mean, some other characters refer to her as Queen, but she refers to herself as Pharaoh. And there is some precedent for this, some indication of this in the archaeological record. So here we've got a votive stele that was set up at the very beginning of Cleopatra's reign, and you see her name in it there. And here she is offering to the goddess Isis, and she's represented as a man, as a pharaoh, male pharaoh. And it's possible that this had originally been carved for her father, and it was quickly repurposed for her after his death and her accession, or it's simply that this was not a problem for the Egyptians to sort of envisage this sort of thing. So yes, in Egypt, during her reign, she is, at the early part of her reign before the Civil War, she is Pharaoh. In the game, she states that she is Egypt, that she is a living goddess. She doesn't specify which one, but I think we can infer that she means Isis, because historically Cleopatra did like to dress as Isis, called herself the new Isis. And she shows concern for the Apis bull. And we also have another stele, and it's from after her death, but it refers to her honouring the Bacchus bull at the beginning of her reign in 51 BCE. So it's not the Apis bull, it's the Bacchus bull, but we're still sort of seeing her doing Egyptian religious activity. She uses Egyptians like Bayek and Aya to accomplish her goals, and she's certainly differentiated from the Greeks and Romans around her. Our first sighting of her is, appropriately enough, at a banquet at the villa belonging to Apollodorus. Many Roman sources present her as an enthusiastic partier, and this is not done in a complimentary way, this is a criticism. According to Plutarch, she and Antony formed a drinking society called the Inimitable Livers. This would later become the Partners in Death, when everything was all going a bit wrong. And amusingly enough, an inscription from this time has been found in Alexandria that refers to Antony as an inimitable lover. So clearly this was something that was like well known in Alexandria. She is presented as drinking, as wanting opium, in a sort of very relaxed way. Although, interestingly enough, once Bayek arrives, she's all business, straight onto the table with the map and the little models and the strategy. So, you know, do we wonder there? Should we infer that her previous demeanour was some kind of act, some sort of public act? Well, you know, we don't know. The game doesn't tell us, but potentially, you know. Ancient sources do tell us that she liked to play act. She would set up elaborate scenarios to gain the upper hand, particularly with Antony. There are lots of amusing stories about the ways that she would tease him. Promiscuity. She, when we very first see her, she is essentially offering herself to anyone who is prepared to spend the night with her and then be killed in the morning. And from the sort of conversation around that, it seems it's not the first time this has happened. This is a regular occurrence. And there's no ancient evidence for this, but it appears it's the premise of a 1917 Russian ballet performance. And so I guess it's become a sort of popular tale. And so again, we sort of have a look at these costumes and sort of see certain sort of parallels with previous ones. She flirts with the sailors on the ship that she boards, she flirts with Caesar, she offers him true marriage, and presumably what she means by that is marriage that actually includes sex, because her marriage with her younger brother clearly doesn't. While later Roman propaganda certainly played up her sexuality, one actually claimed that she slept with her slaves, it's probable that she only had relationships with Caesar and Antony, and while these weren't recognised as marriages in the eyes of the Romans, they likely were in Egypt, or at least it was irrelevant whether they were or they weren't, because she was the queen, she was the pharaoh, and what mattered was that the children that were produced by these relationships were going to be pharaoh and members of the royal family afterwards. She's intelligent. She converses with Caesar about the Roman poet Catullus and the Greek philosopher Plato. According to Cicero, and this is it's a historical document, his letters, she actually made some kind of literary promise to him. Perhaps she offered him some books from the library at Alexandria, but these didn't materialise, and he was rather annoyed about it. And her name is connected with ancient texts on topics like cosmetics and gynecology and alchemy. So it's in the historical record that she was very intelligent, very well educated. She spoke 9 languages apparently, including Egyptian. She's able to manipulate Caesar very easily. She uses Alexander the Great's tomb as a bit of a lure for him. Plutarch tells us that she did similar things with Antony. She took one look at him, sized him up, and then for the sort of remaining time played him like a fiddle, and he was apparently none the wiser. Including tricking him into believing that she'd committed suicide, so that he then, conveniently for her, did the same thing. She is political. Throughout the game, she allies herself expediently. First with Apollodorus, who seems to be her sort of #1 fan, loyal retainer. Then with Aya and Bayek, then Pompey, then Caesar, and finally the Order of the Ancients. She's merciless in victory. She orders the twin priestesses, who have been poisoning the Apis bull, and these are actual historical figures, although from earlier on, from 164 BCE, to be boiled inside a bronze bull. And this is also a historical torture implement used in Sicily, but not by Cleopatra. She orders Aya to assassinate her brother, Ptolemy XIII, and says, make it so, make him dead. And this papyrus that was discovered a few years ago and is a decree about tax incentives dating to 33 BCE has what has been interpreted as her signature, essentially. And it says, quite literally, ginesto, it's in Greek is, make it so. So there's this reference there to her royal decree style. And incidentally, I think that makes it something. This is something like the third or possibly the fourth ancient signature of a historical figure to survive from antiquity, and possibly the first woman. So very, very important papyrus, although you could be forgiven for not really thinking that, just looking at it. Notably, Cleopatra is an antagonist. Despite Origen's presentation of the Romans as villains in league with the enemies of Bayek, Aya, and their fledgling brotherhood of assassins, the game leans into the historical Roman presentation of Cleopatra, which is based on the propaganda disseminated by Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir, who would later become the first Emperor Augustus, so therefore a rival to Caesarion, in an attempt to retroactively legitimise his civil war with Antony. Cleopatra, as a foreign female monarch, three things that the Romans simply couldn't abide, was a convenient scapegoat. And so here we've got some of Octavian's propaganda, and so he issues coins to celebrate his victory with Egypt, or possibly Cleopatra represented as a crocodile with the words Egypt captured on it. We see reliefs commemorating his victory at the Battle of Actium, which was a sea battle, so we've got the crocodile down here again. All of her positive qualities were suppressed, forgotten, and her negative ones promoted, exaggerated, and this has remained the case for 2,000 years. So later in the Roman period, we start to see her essentially becoming a figure of fun, mockery, caricature. So we get sort of pornographic images, essentially. This one of her having sex with a crocodile, and this one of her, possibly her and Antony, having sex on a ship on the Nile. So it's basically a joke. While there are some positive aspects to Ubisoft's portrayal of Cleopatra, so her intelligence, her political skill, these are two qualities that are frequently ignored in dramatizations. Considering what could have been done with the character, the choices made are somewhat disappointing, embracing 2,000 years worth of racist and sexist stereotypes, in contemporary terminology, misogynoir. And I found this when I was preparing my course for my undergraduates and postgraduates, and I just thought it really summed up the whole point of me actually offering a course on Cleopatra in the first place, because if you asked a sort of average person in the streets who Cleopatra was or something about her, this is probably sort of roughly what you would get. Admittedly, it's considerably less offensive than the portrayal of Cleopatra in Dante's Inferno. Have any of you played this game, or have you heard of it? So, for those of you who haven't, Dante's Inferno, which was released in 2010, is a video game recreation of the famous Italian epic poem. It's very similar in sort of design and approach to God of War. It sees Cleopatra and Antony condemned to the second circle of hell. They've struck a deal with Lucifer. They're ruling the circle in exchange for their loyalty. So you play as Dante, who arrives in the circle in pursuit of Beatrice, who he loves. So Cleopatra, I'm going to just give you a brief description of what happens during this whole boss fight. Cleopatra summons the Carnal Tower, so make of that what you will, and the Lust Storm. Dante climbs the tower. When he reaches the top, Cleopatra, the boss, summons Antony. She stores him inside her body and comes out through her mouth when she needs him. And she assists him with magic, but Dante slays Antony. Cleopatra mourns him, for a minute or two. Then she tries to seduce Dante, and Dante's not really up for it, so he stabs her through the heart. And as you can see, this Cleopatra is highly sexualized, bare-breasted. She even births knife-wielding babies, unbaptized babies, because we're in hell, out of her nipples. But yeah. If you're really interested, you can find this on YouTube. You can get the whole thing. Saying that Origin's presentation of Cleopatra is better than this, I think, is setting the bar extremely low. Clearly, Ubisoft is not using Origins to educate or re-educate gamers about her. Should we expect it to? It is, after all, a game, a piece of entertainment. But one of the hallmarks of the Assassin's Creed series has always been its involvement of historians and archaeologists in order to undertake faithful recreations of the historical locations it uses in its games. So particularly notable for this at the moment is how the digital recreation of Notre Dame in Assassin's Creed Unity has been presented as a possible aid for reconstructing the cathedral in the wake of last year's devastating fire. You can find the specs online if you're interested in learning a bit more about this. The ultimate extension of this has been the introduction of the Discovery Tour mode, which has now been included in the two most recent instalments in the franchise, Origins and Odyssey. Schools, colleges and universities are being encouraged to use it as a learning experience, and apparently students are finding it very, very interesting and engaging. The tagline in Origins is "Explore this virtual museum mode with guided tours and historical locations set in a combat and quest-free environment." Its content was apparently curated by Egyptologists and was 4 years in development, so I think it's reasonable to assume that it would be accurate. One of its featurettes is devoted to Cleopatra and provides a brief overview of her life that generally accords with the interpretation presented in Origins, although there are a lot of factual inaccuracies. Now, I did say I wasn't going to fact-check the game. I am going to fact-check the Discovery Tour, because, that's the whole point of it, supposedly. The objects used are not securely identified as Cleopatra. Her father's name is incorrect. They call him Ptolemy Aulos. He's actually Ptolemy Auletes. The difference being an Aulos is a flute, Auletes is a flute player, and possibly a reference to oral sex, which is part of his negative reputation. She didn't meet Caesar wrapped in a carpet. Caesar couldn't make Caesarion his heir. It wasn't that he didn't want to or refused to, it was that legally he couldn't because he wasn't Roman. Antony wanted money to fight his Parthian campaign in the east, not to fight Octavian, and it also says that she died by arsenic poisoning, which I have no idea where that came from. So why go to all the trouble of undertaking extensive historical and archaeological research in conjunction with internationally renowned Egyptologists, creating a complex and engaging narrative, and then resort to the same old racist and sexist cliches regarding the character of Cleopatra? Perhaps because audiences expect certain things from that character, past attempts to deviate from the cliche have met with resistance, such as the portrayal of Cleopatra in HBO's Rome, or the proposed film version of Stacey Schiff's Cleopatra starring Angelina Jolie. This was supposedly going to be about a much more intelligent political Cleopatra, much more of a sort of political thriller, but it's been stuck in development hell for years, and nobody seems to be particularly enthusiastic about it. So I think it's a shame. I think it would be great, but clearly that is not what people want from a film about Cleopatra. Significantly, this difficulty people have with reconciling what they believe to be historically accurate and what actually is historically accurate seems to be particularly common with regard to the role of women in historical games. A case in point is the recent furore over the inclusion of female generals in Total War Rome 2, which led to the game being review bombed on Steam. When challenged about what a certain section of the gaming community perceived to be historical inaccuracy, Creative Assembly argued that the game was intended to be historically authentic, not historically accurate, and that, in any case, female generals would only spawn under certain very specific circumstances. The company explicitly stated that Greece and Rome would not have female generals. Down here. Despite the fact that these civilizations both did on numerous occasions. No matter how many academics, myself included, attempted to argue that female generals were perfectly plausible in antiquity and even offered illustrative examples, minds were not changed. so, is the racist and sexist portrayal of Cleopatra in Origins a preemptive attempt to appease racist and sexist gamers, and anyone else who has an axe to grind, whether they care about gaming or not? Sort of like the video nasty thing. That's one possibility, and one that's rather damning of Ubisoft, if that's the case. Although saying that, I mean, my partner is a computer game programmer, and he says to me, companies will do whatever they think will make them money, and you know, that's not, they're not necessarily being racist or sexist out of entrenched racism or sexism, they're just being capitalist. So make of that what you will. Inquiries from journalists to Ubisoft about this have apparently gone unanswered. Is there an alternative explanation that's a bit kinder? What about the character of Aya, later Aminette? According to her character information, she's half Greek, half Egyptian, the daughter of scholars who was educated at the Library of Alexandria in ancient history, philosophy, mathematics and languages. She was a devoted wife and mother before her separation from Bayek following the death of their son Camus, after which she devoted herself to Egypt instead. She's politically engaged, far more so than Bayek, who really isn't that bothered. You know, he does what she asks him to do. She's a good sailor, well versed in hand-to-hand combat and assassination, including the use of poisons. In the spin-off Origins comic, she doesn't actually, as it turns out, despite all of this, assassinate Cleopatra, but rather gives her the poison that she uses to take her own life. A myth grows up around her, perpetuated over centuries by the Hidden Ones and the Brotherhood of Assassins, and this rather neatly ties in with the fundamental ambiguity surrounding the historical Cleopatra's death. There's a considerable amount of overlap between the historical Cleopatra and the fictional Aya. Her dual heritage and identity, her education, her spousal and maternal devotion, her concern for the Kingdom of Egypt and its survival in the face of Roman expansion, her political skill, her involvement in naval and land battles, her knowledge of poisons. Ultimately, again going by the Assassin's Creed Origins comic, she takes Caesarion under her wing and has him join the Hidden Ones, thereby stepping in as his surrogate mother and or mentor. So perhaps the reason that Cleopatra is presented the way that she is because her many historically attested positive qualities have been transferred to Aya. I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about this. Thank you very much.